Hello, everyone. Now we are talking about chapter 6, and this is the last chapter of Unit 2. So, Unit 2 exam will be over chapters 4, 5, and 6. So, it'll really deal, hopefully, the religion stuff isn't a little too much for you, but the truth is between the chapter on all of these different religions that kind of began very early or at different times, and this chapter, the next, the chapter 5, where the Catholic Church kind of takes hold over things. And then this one really will emphasize the Catholic Church, mainly because it's going to talk about some of the ways that they interacted with humans and with human societies. What did they require? How did they, in some ways, grapple with towns and cities? And in some ways, how did they create issues or deal with issues in a way that was perhaps less than helpful? And these methods would eventually lead to an issue that would bubble over into the Protestant Reformation. Some of the other factors that would deal with that would also be the Renaissance, which we're going to cover in chapters 7 and 8. But we will get to that in the next unit. So everything, the truth is everything kind of bleeds into each other. It's not like there's a fixed time period for each one of these things. But over the years, certain facets come forward, certain things fall back, certain practices become normal, and certain practices become less normal. So all of that, some things become obsolete and other things arise for the first time. Sometimes the history repeats itself. And that's, sometimes even architectural periods repeat themselves. So I guess I just want you to keep that in mind so that you can kind of see how everything sort of flows into the next thing in a very Taoist way. Now, we talked about the Romanesque period in architecture was the period we talked about at the very end of the last lecture, where the hallways within, well, the sanctuaries within the churches were very, very tall with rounded vaulted ceilings. Um, they were kind of narrow and cramped, but they had these huge uh, stone colonnades on the sides that were holding up the weight of the church because the churches had gotten far taller than they had ever been before. So it's quite beautiful. Now it's going to be compared, though, in this chapter with the Gothic age, and that is the very latest part of the medieval period. It really it is the end of the medieval period. So, and the word Gothic, you've probably heard of a Gothic novel or like a Goth. And I don't mean a Visigoth, which is, please keep that straight. Visigoths are actually a nomadic tribe that warred with people. And then we have Goths that, who were highly prevalent when I was in high school, who wore really dark clothing and black lipstick and dyed their hair and fingernails and everything. Everything was black. And then we have today we call them emo. So I guess my kids are all like, that's not God, that's emo. But it is. It's but those are that's not, and none of this is Gothic as far as what we're talking about now. The Gothic age is really connected to the Gothic architectural style. And it's called Gothic because it's seen as macabre and grotesque. No, it's not actually a beautiful term that people use for buildings. It took a long time for people to decide that Gothic buildings were beautiful. Probably the most famous Gothic cathedral is the Cathedral de Notre Dame in Paris, which burned just a few years ago. They were doing some restoration on it and something got fire and the whole side of it ended up being damaged pretty severely. But they raised a tremendous amount of money to fix it. And that's kind of what happened actually at this time. If any Romanesque cathedral fell or burned down or something happened to it, the people would kind of get a collection together because they wanted a cathedral or they wanted a very large church in their neighborhood. So a lot of buildings that happened at this time were either additions or rebuilds of some of the earlier churches, but they are strikingly different from the Romanesque cathedral, and we'll cover some of those elements as well. But really, this is, in some ways, it's more of the same. Feudalism still does exist, and it is still thriving. So we have kings, and underneath those, we have lords who serve the king, and then underneath those lords, we have knights and vassals who serve the lords. And each one of those groups has some plots of land as a reward for their fealty to the people above them. Underneath all of that is 90% of the population. Those are the serfs and the slaves and the destitute, the servants. And they own no land and make almost nothing and live in near starvation their entire lives. So if you were born at this time, and I'm trying not to sugarcoat it, but if you were born in the time of chivalry and knights and fealty and all that stuff, more than likely, I mean, we have 24 people, I think, in this class, and more than likely, 2.4 of us would have any sort of uh, wealth or anything like that. The rest of us would all be abjectly poor. So just keep that in mind. I do like knights and chivalry. I think those stories are wonderful, but living at this time would not be something I wanted to do. Plus, most of Europe was really backwards as far as medicine and science. So if you were to get sick, they would likely take leeches and bleed you or cut you with a lance and bleed you because they thought if you got some more excess blood out of you, then you'd get better. What it often did is kill people because it wasn't a great time. This was also the time when waves of the plague began. And this is one of those things, we're going to talk about it more at the beginning of chapter 7 because it would probably more than any other factor, it would bring about the Renaissance, the plague, literally. But we'll talk about that when we get there. For now, the church is in power. It has control over all of Europe. And when I say the church, I mean the only church that deems itself in existence. There were no, now today we have Baptists and Presbyterians and different kinds of Catholics and different kinds of Baptists and, different kinds of other, holiness and non-denominational and Unitarian, blah, blah, blah. None of those existed at this time. Not a single one. Only Holy Roman Catholic, Judaism did exist, Islam existed, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity existed. So we have all of the denominations that we're used to seeing just around the city blocks did not exist. The Catholic Church held more power than any single entity in the world at this time. They owned more land, had more wealth, and certainly had more influence than any other institution. So part of that was because of what they helped spur on, and that was the Crusades. They were supposed to be holy wars, to defend Christianity and to gain back Jerusalem for Christians. That actually didn't happen. In fact, no real land was changed hands. Sometimes it would, barriers and borders would fluctuate, but in the end, pretty much everybody kept their land. In the end, though, a lot of towns, especially within the realms of Islamic lands, were devastated, and their wealth was stolen and taken into Europe. So it made a lot of money for people, but it also somehow created a link not only to Islamic lands, but to the Silk Road in China. And so through that, suddenly Europeans had access to information, technology, and textiles and art that they had never seen before and knew nothing about. And so silk, for instance, it's called the Silk Road because of that. Until the end of the Crusades, there was no silk in Europe because no one had access to it. Arabic countries did, Islamic countries did, but no one in Europe did. And so the silk became the thing. Silk taffeta, silk velvet, all of these things made of this one kind of substance that is still today woven from silkworms. Those were in high demand. And so China made a lot of money for the next several centuries. They still kind of do, but it's because they had a level of technology and artistry that no one else in the world had. Now, why? That's probably a good question before we go to, the kind of backward medieval period. In China, unlike most civilizations, China rewarded intelligence and knowledge and learning. So they had anybody who lived anywhere near any sort of town with any development had access to education. And well, no, any man, I should say. Women did not have the same access, but men could go and they could go take classes, they could learn, they could read, and they could, to move up in society, they actually took, to move up in job position and in government, or even in like area governments, they could take tests to prove their knowledge base, their aware, their understanding of mythology, Greek Chinese mythology and Chinese traditions and Chinese history. And they could move up and often they did, even in their 50s and 60s. So learning was constant. The arts too, especially the tactile arts, like sewing and weaving and pottery and metal working, those were all fostered through education. So normally in the European system, if you wanted to be a silversmith, for instance, you would pay actually to study for a number, 5 to 7 years as a journeyman with a master. And then at the end of that, you would become a master craftsman as well. In China, it was a bit more rigorous, but it was also a lot less expensive. So for free, you could go and serve in a household where someone was a master craftsman, and you could learn the trade. And some of these trades literally would have 14 years of training. I just visited, about a decade ago, I visited UCLA, and they had a display of silk embroidery on silk screens. So the silk screens themselves were see-through, and then the embroidery was done so that you could view it from either side of the panel. So there was no knotting, there was no messiness. It was, in some cases, photographic realism, only in embroidery. It was magnificent. But the very base level of training required 14 years of training with a master. And so the technology, their pottery, for instance, was so fine and so well glazed that it came to be known as china instead of pottery. So when you, for instance, go get married, you're going to pick out your wedding china, not your wedding pottery, your wedding china. So it became synonymous with the country where it came from. And that's because it was such high quality. And that was the way that so much of what China produced was. It's not the same now where, everything's plastic and cheap. It really was. It was very expensive, and yet it was of such great quality that the demand in Europe and other parts of the world was huge and will remain huge for a long time. So that access kind of exposed the Europeans to a very different set of skills, of values, of knowledge, science, medicine. And so along with all these artifacts, these beautifully made objects and textiles, they also brought in books. And by this point, for instance, China had a printing press for, they got theirs in the 8th century. So by even 1200, they've already been printing books for 400 years. They developed explosive chemicals, and they of course they used them mostly for fireworks. Eventually they were used for cannon fire in war, and then that was adopted as well by Europeans. Of course they didn't want the fireworks, they wanted war. But the truth is a lot of these technologies suddenly became viable opportunities for the Europeans as well. And that trade will have a huge effect on the rise of the Renaissance as well. It also will have an effect on commerce and on people's kind of worldview. And that will be in direct opposition sometimes to what the church wants people to do. We'll find that towns and cities often are at odds with churches because the Catholic Church wants to control when shops open and what happens and how tourists are treated and who can have an inn and who cannot. And the townships want the control over that instead. And this kind of happens here today. We actually have a few places in some states which have what are called blue laws, and they are religiously based laws that govern, for instance, when a store can open on a Sunday or when it has to close on a Saturday, when alcohol can be served or not served, things like that. And there's often opposition between tradespeople who want to have their shops open or want to sell something for longer, and that governance that is religiously based, that wants things closed, especially on Sundays. So that kind of thing this is where the wrangling really starts, when trade becomes an ever-present part of daily lives of these people. So if there's trade in objects, there's trade in information, there's trade in books, there's trade in science and math and other learning, other knowledge bases. And there's also an increase in access to classical literature, which for the most part, the church had pretty much squashed. A lot of Greek and Roman literature had been hidden, really. The Vatican actually owns a gigantic library of pre-Christian texts, both from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And sometimes it has the only copy of some things, but it intentionally controlled all of that. It really didn't want people to have, at least people who weren't clergy, to have access to those kinds of documents. So it also often squashed medical technologies and scientific discoveries. And if you made a scientific discovery that the church didn't like, or that the church believed went against their doctrine, you could be executed for that. And we're going to talk about some of the other punishments that they had. But the townships really were the ones who had any sort of sway, because when you have enough people within a town and the vast majority want a particular something, it was easier to go against what the church demanded. But the church still had power, and they had power that honestly no one else on earth had, because of their control of the people's faith and how that faith was administered and what that faith would result in. So they could determine, they could essentially demand certain levels of taxation, they could demand behaviors, and they could certainly demand silence. And so we're going to look at ways that they did that. Probably the most important thing to remember, you guys know, you've seen trials by jury. You've seen, whether real on like court TV or something, or fictional, like in Law and Order or something like that. So, but you know how a trial runs, everybody gets a defense attorney, everybody get, another prosecuting attorney, but you have a chance to be a witness. You can call other witnesses. All witnesses get to be cross-examined. There are a lot of rules to protect whoever's been accused of a crime. You're innocent until proven guilty, all that stuff. They can't hold you in a jail cell without charging you with something. But all of those rules have been created over time to protect people from being overwhelmed and from being condemned without deserving it, unfairly. Well, church power at this time, though, had a whole other set of legal courts. They're the ecclesiastical courts, or the religious courts. That's what ecclesiastical means. And so we had regular civil and criminal courts that the government ran, whether at the local or country level. But then we had church courts. Many of those, of course, were centered in Rome, where the Holy Roman Catholic Church's center was, where the papal center was, the Pope was living. But the church had these ecclesiastical courts everywhere, and they could bring you up on charges, and you had almost no rights. So you didn't have a right to an attorney. You didn't have the right to defend yourself. You didn't have the right to bear witness or to cross-examine witnesses. In fact, they could hold a trial without you even there or even knowing about it. They could put you in prison and keep you there for years and years and never charge you with anything. They could torture you to try to get you to confess to crimes you didn't commit until you died. They could literally torture you to death, and there was nothing that anyone could do. They had the power and the authority to do this, and it superseded all the rest of authority. And so it's hard for us to imagine, but that's the way it was. They were the stop, the end all and be all. And if they said you were in jail, you were in jail. So it was, usually if you were accused of something, it was going to go badly for you, because there was really no defense. And if you were accused of something like heresy or witchcraft, the likelihood of your getting out without being at least exiled, if not executed, was very slim. And a lot of people went into ecclesiastical prison and had extensive jail time, or were executed, often without even a trial. So that was pretty typical. The church believed, though, they justified this because they said, look, even if we torture a person to death, if we have the chance to save their soul, then that's worth it. It's worth their death if it saves their soul. And so for them, that in their minds, at least that's how they justified it, they were saving people's souls by keeping them from being heretics. Now, they had three big punishments, and I call them the three X's, but all three were meant to try to encourage them to stay within the family of the church and do what the church wanted. Okay. And if you didn't do it, that's when they do the last one, because that's when, oh, we've given up on you, and there's obviously no way to fix you. So the first one that was most likely was excommunication. And usually it only came after you proved yourself to be unwilling to change. So if they said you keep saying this, or you're bad mouthing this particular minister and you can't do that, that's heresy, and you say, well, I don't care, that's when something would be instituted. And the first level of defense was usually excommunication. That's where it's, and it actually still exists in the Catholic Church. It's in several other religions as well. I think in Jehovah's Witnesses, it's called disfellowship. You get disfellowshipped. And that just means that anybody who's a member of the church is no longer supposed to speak with you. You are not invited to come to church. You are essentially not saved. You're not going to go to heaven. You are kicked out of the church community. And you can actually, the church could actually do it not just against an individual, but they could do it against a family. They could do it against an entire town or city or even country. And that was actually called an interdict. So if, for instance, they excommunicated the king of a country, for instance, and the country still liked the king and they still decided he should be king, then they could interdict the entire country for remaining with the king. They could excommunicate a person, and if other people in his family continued to communicate with him, they could interdict the entire family. So that's kind of how that worked. But it's just excommunication of a large group of people. And then if that didn't work, if they were still saying things and slandering the church or doing whatever the church didn't like, then they would be exiled. So they'd be kicked out of where they were living and they would be forced to live somewhere else, often for years. And they couldn't return until the church said they could, because if they returned before the church allowed it, then their execution would be ordered. And executions were usually ordered in writing. So we do know of many records where executions were given from the papal seat, from the head church of Rome. They were sent out, and essentially they ordered the execution of different people. Martin Luther, who founded the Lutheran Church and really started the whole Protestant movement, he was under excommunication first, and he took the excommunication order and burned it in front of his parishioners. And so his execution was ordered. They never caught him, though. In fact, they ordered the execution of him and anyone who was harboring him. So if he was caught in your barn, then you would have died as well. But he was never caught, and he died of natural causes. So, but the church tried. The other things that they could do too is if, for instance, you were trying to translate the Bible, and this happened many times, both to women and men. We actually had female translators as well. If they caught, these were all handwritten books for the longest time. So if you were translating the Bible into German, say, or English or French, and you were caught by the church, they would threaten you. They essentially say, look, you better be careful. We're going to kick you out of the church. Don't do it again. And they'd take your translation and destroy it. Because remember, you were handwriting it. If you did it again, there was no, hey, don't do this again. You were executed. And people were burned at the stake for this, because this was considered to be heresy. Now, if you think about it, I don't know how many of you have, or your families have Bibles laying around, but you can go to a bookstore now and you can get a Bible translated in all sorts of different ways. That was simply unheard of at this time, because if someone were caught having translated a Bible, they would be executed. That was just, you just don't do that. And heaven forbid you try to, distribute it to other people and let them read it. The church did not want people to read the Bible for themselves, mainly because much of what the church did wasn't necessarily word for word dictated in the Bible. So they wanted people to follow their version of what needed to happen. Now, they thought they were right. I'm not trying to say, Catholic Church is bad or anything like that. They really thought this is the right way to live, and this is just kind of like Orthodox Church. They had right thinking. They really believed that they were right, but at the expense of many people dying. Now, let me give you one example to show you just how powerful the church was. So this is from early British literature and British history, and it involves Henry II, who's actually the father of Richard the Lionhearted and King John, and their two brothers who are in, if you've ever seen like even the Disney Robin Hood, Richard the Lionhearted is the oldest brother, and he was off at the Crusades, and he ended up being captured, and John took over. Rather than pay his ransom, he took over and tried to be king, and then Richard came back. And anyway, their father, Henry II, was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. And he had several kids with her, 3 boys and I think some daughters too. And yet she was a very powerful person and very intelligent, and they did not get along super well. And so eventually he had her imprisoned. Just, she stayed in a prison for like, I don't know, 11 years or something. But he didn't want to stay married to her, but he wanted alliances with France. So this was after the end of the king over France, and he thought he was king over France and England too, and there's a lot of that squabbling, but he wanted to marry a princess from France. And so he petitioned the Pope for an annulment of his first marriage. There was no such thing as divorce. And so he asked the Pope for an annulment so that he could marry because Eleanor was still alive, but he wanted to marry this other girl, this other princess from France. Pope said no. Well, then Thomas Becket, who was actually a super good friend of Henry II, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most powerful church positions in England. And so his bishopric was settled over in, archbishopric was over in Canterbury Cathedral. Henry II, thinking he now had an in, asked Becket to argue his case to the Pope and ask for an annulment again. And he thought, well, with Becket arguing, I'll get in, and I'll get the annulment. Becket refused. He said, you're not only have you been married for years and years and years, but you have children by your wife. And usually an annulment cannot be given if there are any offspring, because an annulment is given with the assumption that something couldn't be consummated. There was no divorce. And so Henry II was furious that he couldn't marry the girl he wanted to marry, and B, that Thomas Becket, his supposed bestie friend, refused to help him. So he got drunk and was talking to a bunch of his knights, and he says, wouldn't it be great if someone would just go and kill Becket? His knights left, went to Canterbury Cathedral, and slaughtered Thomas Becket in the sanctuary of the cathedral, right inside the church. Now, churches at this time, and it didn't matter what religion you were talking, were places of sanctuary. So you weren't supposed to do any violence inside of a church. If someone who was even a criminal who escaped and his captors and ran to a church for sanctuary would be given sanctuary. So it was one of those safe spaces. And yet here was this archbishop, super powerful archbishop of the church, and he was slaughtered. They stabbed him, and there was blood everywhere. I mean, it was a gory thing. Well, so what happens now? The Pope was furious, and he actually ordered Henry II to publicly admit wrongdoing. So he had to essentially sign a mea culpa, my fault, document, and then pay restitution both to the church and to Becket's family, which Henry II did. Why? He didn't want to be excommunicated. He was that afraid. If he were excommunicated, what happens? He could lose his power. Because if he's excommunicated and all of his subjects are Christian, they don't have to follow him anymore. So what did he do? He publicly admitted his wrongdoing, and he paid restitution. He did exactly what the church wanted him to do. Even though he was king of England, he obeyed the church because the church held more sway than he did. And that's the way the world was at this point. Now, we're going to see a contrast once we get to the Renaissance, but right now, this is the way the world works. Even the kings, who were the very most powerful people, were subject to the church. At the same time, and or on the other hand, if you want to put it that way, medieval universities were beginning to crop up. Remember in chapter 5, we talked about uh, the actual monasteries and how they were all run by priests, but you could go to a monastery and get learning. You could take classes and work with the scholars there, but they were all priests. Suddenly, in 1150, the very first university in Europe begins, and it is a secular university. It is not taught by priests. It's not on convent or monastery grounds. This is a much more liberal arts education, if you want to think about that. In fact, if anything, they're patterned much more towards Plato and Aristotle's school in Athens than any other type of learning. They're not, in fact, you could go through and get a degree, never take any class that was remotely religious. You took classes on math and science and rhetoric and writing and medicine, and all of it is going to be about, and on the arts, on painting even. You were more likely to get classes on music and painting than you were to get classes on religion. And it's funny too, because it was very egalitarian way. You could go and you could honestly go pretty cheaply. It was not horribly expensive. And more the upper middle and then middle class would be going to these kinds of institutions, but they were very liberal. So students would study hard and everything, and then they party hard. And so some of these communities would get pretty infamous for having a rowdy student body. And that still sort of happens today. Students still study and then go and party. So this was actually pretty common. But these universities took away not only income, because the students were going to these universities instead of to monasteries, but they offered a far more liberal education so that students could learn a lot of things that were beyond the scope of any monastery setting. And so it shifted education away from the church and into the secular world. And that would remain. Like even today in this country, for instance, we have separation of church and state. So we do have high schools and elementary schools that are religiously affiliated private schools, but the vast majority of our educational system is public and mostly free, which is something that did not exist at this time. So, but it really, they were looking at classical texts. They were, you could study Greek and Latin, and many people did. And this would eventually lead to a push to translate the Bible from Latin into other languages. But these people really wanted to be scientists and scholars and mathematicians, and they did not have any inclination to go into the priesthood or to be part of the church or church hierarchy. So it was a very big shift over to secular learning. The other thing that was happening, and this is something that, we talked about, we actually talked about King Henry II. Well, his son, after Richard the Lionhearted, King John took over. And at the same time, Philip of Spain, who actually knew Richard the Lionhearted, took all of his French land away from, they said essentially, King John, you own no French land. You are king of England only. You're not king of any part of France. And so John said, John, was not a very popular king, and he was not a very strong king. And his nobles were furious that he allowed this to happen. And so they rose up. There was kind of a civil war. And eventually what they did is they developed what's called the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. And this stipulated that no king had absolute power, and that his power would always be subject to Parliament and to the will of the people. And so this was a huge shift, because kings until that time could pretty much do whatever they wanted with impunity. But now suddenly England had a parliament. Now, their parliament is not like what we're used to. Their parliament, it was at that time only a House of Lords. So it was upper class people, the nobility, who inherited seats from their fathers and grandfathers. So there were still no elections, but it still spread out the power so that John himself and any king that came after him would not have as much power as Henry II, for instance, did. And he couldn't do things with impunity. So the parliament would actually set up much of the restructuring of the government. would actually, raise the taxes or lower the taxes, or it would decide on budgets. And so from that point on, the king would slowly have a lesser and lesser and lesser impact. And today he's only a figurehead in England. And that's actually the way a lot of kingships have gone over the centuries. But it was also a way other governments could see, oh wait, this is kind of a cool way to go. So by the time we get to, for instance, the end of the 19th century, the only real king who had any sort of implacable power was the Tsar of Russia. And that would end very dramatically with the Russian Revolution, when Tsar Nicholas and his family would all be assassinated. So, but the trend is definitely moving away from all of that. Then Paris, of course, it's the first university, and then a bunch of other universities pop up too, but then Paris becomes this kind of tourist center, which it still is today. And all of this would anger the English, because they saw themselves, the king especially saw himself as king of France and England, thanks to William the Conqueror, right? Well, then we begin the 100 Years' War. So 1066 is when William the Conqueror took over England and killed Harold II in the Battle of Hastings. 1337, so 200 and what? No, 300, almost, well, 270 something years later, the 100 Years' War begins. And it's actually 114 years long. It's not 100 years long. But France and England would fight for over a century about who owns what and who's king of what. Eventually, Henry V of England would defeat the armies in France, and would marry the Princess of France, Catherine, and would unite the kingdom briefly. Henry VI would lose it all. So, so much for that. But the 100 Years' War is important because of what happens during the war. And the reason why the British win is because they get access to the Chinese invention of the cannonball. And they are able to mow through troops, and they can break down walls of fortified castles. And they essentially, all of the normal things that were part of feudalism, you shooting little arrows and wearing armor and all that stuff, ended, because they developed the longbow, and the longbow with its longer arrows could pierce armor, and the cannonball could pierce a castle wall. So suddenly castles were no longer easy to defend, and knights shouldn't be wearing armor because it didn't work. And that was the end of feudalism. So that's probably the biggest thing that happened there. And it really was, I mean, what didn't happen is that the England and France were not unified for any length of time. Other than that, though, it radically would change warfare, and all of the stuff about knights and chivalry and castles and stuff like that. All of those became moot because they were no longer valid. You had to fight differently from this point on, because of what was brought over from the East, and the technology that had changed. Probably the only other shift there was like that will be in World War I, when we were using far older tactics with things that were brand new, like mustard gas and that kind of warfare. And it made for a very ghastly war, mainly because the two, how people were trained and what technologies we had just were incompatible. And that's kind of what happened here. After this is over, though, it's not like people don't like knights and chivalry. Oh, they just kind of romanticize it all. And this is where the rise of the Arthurian literature really happens. Everybody wants to read Arthurian literature. It becomes the new thing. And it's all very idealized. Here we have King Arthur and his court, with the, Lancelot, the most fantastic knight ever, and all of these knights who are super great and always protect women, even though they really don't. And so it just glamorized all of chivalry and what chivalry stood for and what feudalism had been. And it really wasn't true, but it made for a really good story. And that was actually from the last time. Okay, so let's talk about Gothic architecture. This is also a big shift. And again, it's technology shift as well. So remember the Romanesque architecture that I showed you last time, where we have those kind of rounded arches up, and this is on the left side. So you can see the Latin cross framed in the inner like hallway of the church. You know, where the choir is up at the top of the cross, and then the narthex is where people walk in. That's at the end of the bottom of the cross. And then the transepts are the crossways beam. Well, this was of course very narrow with these humongous colonnades, but you couldn't fit a lot of people across because it was just so narrow. And it had those thick columns had to support the weight above because of the way that this kind of arch was supported. And the windows you can see even in this example down here in the picture are very small, and it's kind of dark. Okay. Then we move over to Gothic architecture, and we have two huge technological advances. One is that the arch is no longer round, it's pointed. And so with a pointed arch, what that means is you can actually, and I'll see, can't really. Okay, so I'm just going to see if I can use this thing. But a point, so we have the regular, and I can't do it, it won't let me. Let's see if I can just do a, no, it's not letting me do anything fun. Well, we can see. So, no, it's just not doing it. Okay, so what all it really is if you have a rounded arch, it's just, you know, with a little circle, half circle end to the top part of it, that distributes things almost straight down from the sides of that circle arc. With a pointed arch, it almost makes like a triangular shape at the top. And so the walls can get much wider, and the weight is still distributed down even more effectively from the sides. So you can end up having narrow, you know, thinner walls, narrower colonnades. You know, those columns can be a lot thinner, you know, half the size. And the ceiling can be taller, and the windows can be gigantic. And so in the end, you're able to open the space twice as wide as it might have otherwise, because you have the weight distributed in a wider way. The other thing they added were what are called flying buttresses. I don't know. I'm going to switch over to because I want to be able to show you this in the chapter, because it's just hard to explain. See, these are the regular narrower. You can see how narrow this part of it is, and yet when you get out into the actual Cathedral of Chartres, it widens out because they use the pointed arch to widen the entire space. And that's kind of what they do. Let me see. And this is Chartres Cathedral from the side up here. But that cathedral, and this is Notre Dame, this is the one I said is most famous, and this is probably where I can show you the best. So over on the sides, you see, you know, those windows they look almost like filigreed lace on the sides, right halfway across the building. And so on the other side of it, though, with the sun streaming in, they're bright colors and they're super ornate. They're really beautiful, and there's gigantic windows. They're probably, trying to think of how tall they are, but they're many, and see, Chartres has some of those as well. But yeah, it doesn't say how large they are. They are, I mean, the ones in Notre Dame are like 25 feet tall. They're literally that big. So these tiny cramped spaces and cramped windows that were common in the Romanesque cathedrals that are shown here become wide open. And another way that they do this, and another way that they add stability to the thinner walls, is that they use what are called flying buttresses. And this picture shows them probably better than any. I have actually in my office a paper model of Notre Dame, and you can see the buttresses on the sides, you know, from the top view. But it's all of these little, they look like almost like skeletal bones sticking out from the outside of the wall. And what they do is further distribute the weight from the ceiling and the walls outward, down to the ground. At the bottom of these walls, and I'll show this chart, I know it's here somewhere, of the flying buttress. Oh, maybe I don't have it. Yeah, there it is. So it comes out from the wall, and then underneath it, at the very bottom of it, often they even put a little arched doorway. So you could go outside the cathedral and you could walk under all of the flying buttresses in a little trail. They often paved the path and everything, almost like it's a contemplation sort of trail. And it's really quite it's cool. But the reason it's called Gothic, and this is the key to where we get the word, people called it Gothic because they thought that outer stretch of bony whatever was ugly. And so, all this, essentially the inside of the cathedral becomes pristine. It's the columns are faced way far, the colonnades are very, very far apart. The space opens up and becomes huge and very tall. It's just breathtaking inside at the expense of all of this stuff on the outside. And that's why they thought it was ugly. So they were watching it being built and they're looking at all of these flying buttresses going, what in the heck is all of this? And the answer is it's bolstering the beauty that's inside. Essentially what they did is, instead of putting all of the colonnades on the inside where we can't see things, they put them on the outside. They distribute all of the weight out to the outside. It's an engineering feat that they had not yet ever done. And it made for beautiful buildings on the inside. Absolutely beautiful. But people had to get used to the bony flying buttress things on the outside. And that's something, I guess, to make sure we pay attention to. So if you get a question talking about, what's the difference between Romanesque and Gothic architecture, which you could, since I'm mentioning it, definitely talk about the fact that they had rounded arches in the Romanesque and pointed arches in the Gothic, and then very thick colonnades in the Romanesque and much thinner colonnades in the Gothic, thicker walls, thinner walls, and small windows. And then the Gothic architecture allowed for much larger windows. This actually helped the pilgrimage industry, where people would go and visit pilgrimages and go and visit all these different churches. If you had these glorious cathedrals people could come and visit, they would. And what also happened, and this kind of allied the church in some ways to the townships, is if people wanted to come and visit your church, then they would come and visit your town, and you'd have people staying at the inn. It would be packed. The restaurants would be packed. You'd make a lot of money from tourists who were doing their little pilgrimages. So it was a boon for both sides that people did all these pilgrimage things. The other thing that's the last thing I'll talk about with the Chartres Cathedral, well, there are two things. One is that it has a window in it called the Notre Dame de la Belle Vierge. So Our Lady of the Beautiful Window. And that's what it's right here in front of you on the left-hand side. But it was part of a movement that had slowly been growing in the Catholic Church of emphasis of Mary, Mother of Jesus, mainly because a lot of people, followers of Christianity, saw her as the intercessor that was going to be more compassionate, more accessible than maybe God or Jesus. And so they specifically emphasized worship to her. And there was actually, it's not really a cult or anything, but a lot of people were more willing to pray to Mary than they were to Jesus or to God, to Jehovah or Yahweh. And so that was shifting some of the practice of Catholicism, even though the church didn't want it to be that way. The other thing that they had is called a labyrinth. And you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of this, and I'll show you the same thing just down here further, right here. But when they redid the cathedral, when they were actually restoring it, they found that back in the 17th century, they had covered over a labyrinth. Now, there are churches today that still have labyrinths. Usually they're outside in it's kind of a garden path or something, but it's meant to be a contemplation labyrinth. So you walk in to the entrance, see at the bottom of this little chart, you walk into that little trail and come in with a question or something that's worrying you or something that you need to pray about or whatever. And then you'd walk all the way through in and you just follow the path and it goes all the way into the center and then you follow it all the way back. And that twisting and turning is almost meditative. And so it allows you to really focus on your question and get insight. But unfortunately, it was covered over, and for several centuries it was gone. So not until the 1990s was it uncovered again. But today people use it. You can actually go and you can follow the path. So it's kind of cool. I think it's cool. I have actually followed one. There was one at a Presbyterian camp that I went to, and it had an outside labyrinth, and I thought that was pretty. It was far more emotional than I thought it was going to be as an experience. So, but I'm open to trying new things. Okay, so the other thing, and this is something that many of you, if you are not either versed in church business or not Catholic, would not know. The Catholic Church required 7 sacraments of its parishioners. So, and they started from the time you were very, very extremely little, when you were just born. Within a few days after you were born, you were to be baptized. Mainly because if you weren't and the baby died, then the baby would automatically go to hell. That was the belief at the time. So you had to have the rite of baptism done before you died, or you would go to hell. Even if you were an infant, 3 days old, doesn't make any difference. Next, the next step was communion, and you would have your first communion. In fact, in a lot of Catholic countries, that's still celebrated when you're about like 5 or 6 years old. You have your first communion, and then you have your confirmation. And then on a weekly basis, at least, if not more often, you are to do confession and repentance. And so you would go to church, you confess your sins, and then they give you some penance to do, and you would go and do that penance. Again, come back again a few days later to a week later. You're not supposed to wait longer than that. But again, it's to get rid of your sins as they're accumulating so that you don't have any sins on your head if something happens. Then when you get married, that marriage is supposed to be ordained in the church. That's according to the church. We'll talk about that in a second. And then men need to be ordained in some sort of, either as elders or in the priesthood or something. And then at the last bit of your life, right before you die, you need to do what is called extreme unction. It's your last rites, where a priest comes to your bedside, you confess whatever sins you have left, and then he purifies you right before you die. If you miss any of these, like if you get married as a civil marriage contract instead of getting married in the church, that's a sin. You're putting more and more sins on yourself by not confessing your sins and getting purified. The problem is all of these sacraments had to be done by a priest, and you had to pay him. And so they're pretty expensive. And a lot of poor people just simply couldn't afford it. And especially if you think about the dad of a family is dying. Well, he hasn't been working, he's been sick, and who else is feeding his family? And so they didn't have the money to give a priest to have him come and do extreme unction. Marriage is an issue because the vast majority of marriages in Europe, even though the Catholic Church held sway, the vast majority of marriages were essentially finalized when the dads of each side, each family, signed the document saying they're going to get married. From that point on, honestly, they could live together, they could have kids, and they are legally married because that document is signed. You can go get married, but if you don't have a document signed between the two families, you're not married. And so there was definitely a rift between what was common practice, legal practice, and what the church demanded. And the problem is too, is if you lived in a rural area, you didn't have a priest. And so people would hand fast. They would, have a civil marriage, and then they'd have to wait until the priest came around. And the priest would literally make a lot of money because he would sanctify marriage, as he was going through his trail of, his path of wandering. And so he'd make a ton of money, but he really didn't have to do anything. All he was doing is sanctifying the marriage by the church. And so a lot of people really were irritated by a lot of this. There were a couple of places that were very, very strongly Catholic that tried to put people in jail for cohabiting without being married to each other in the church. But that was really hard for people to prosecute because the vast majority of the population thought, well, they've signed a contract, they're married. And so that was one the church really didn't, today it is highly uncommon for people to avoid the church and get married outside the church. I mean, a lot of people do that, but they'll get married by a priest or somebody ordained even if it's on the beach or they don't want to be in a church. They still get, you can go to the justice of the peace. That is absolutely legal, and get married, and people do that as well. I actually have known several people who've done that. So, but that was the standard, not the exception. The vast majority back then did not get a big white dress and have, spend $100,000 and fill up a church and then go have a big party. The vast majority did not at all. They would go and have a very small ceremony, and then they'd have a very small wedding breakfast or something, and it wouldn't be a big lavish affair. Very few people wore a dress just for the occasion. They wore regular clothes, just like their church clothes or something. So that was a hard pill for people to swallow. And the truth is, a lot of people did not like the fact that the church was demanding all of these different sacraments, many of them repetitive, so that they wouldn't go to hell. But the truth is people were also deathly afraid of going to hell. And that was the sticking point. Who ruled that? Who decided, and who deemed whether you were going to hell or not? As far as most people were concerned, the church did. So if you died while exiled or excommunicated or not having gone to confession in 3 weeks, people were really scared for you. And the church would also accept prayers after a person had died. So you could go and pay a priest to pray for someone who had died that you didn't think was pure, so that you could help them get to heaven. It's just the way that it was. So that was kind of how the thinking went. Anyway, now, then we get, and this comes from a lot of the classical literature, and access to it, from pre-Christian Greek and Roman authors. But we have a rise in what's called humanism. Now, it's not belief that humans are gods or anything like, and it's not directly opposed to the church. And so it's not anti-religion. And I guess I want to make sure that that's clear to anybody who's reading this. But humanism was seen as an enemy to the church because it shifted the emphasis away from the church as being the center between God and humans. For many centuries, the church had essentially said, yes, you can get to heaven, but the only way you can is through us. We determine what you have to do, what behaviors you have to, and steps you have to take. And then we determine whether you're going to we'll tell you if you're going to go to heaven or not. And humanism instead said, look, why cannot humans have a far more direct relationship to God? So why do they need the church to be the go-between? Can't they pray directly? And shouldn't they pray directly to God? Shouldn't they decide through their own moral compass what's good and bad behavior? Why does it have to involve priests? Why does it have to involve giving money to the church? So that resistance came out, not so much to being religious, but to being, what the church said we had to be. And so that's where the resistance was. A lot of scholars too, people who were even priests who studied religion and had for years, when they became, gained access to the classical texts, they found a lot of moral insight in these pre-Christian texts. And they really felt like if they were really going to study morality, human morality and human judgment, they needed to be able to study texts that weren't necessarily Christian, that weren't necessarily the Bible. And for a while, the church was okay with that, until they felt as if some of that study was threatening their power and their control. And so, and the truth is too, as the church continued, a lot of church, especially upper level figures, were very wealthy, influential people, not necessarily religious people. And people, a lot of the priests who went around, marrying people really quickly so they can make a lot of money, or selling what they called indulgences, where they sold get out of jail free cards. Hey, you've done naughty things, but here you go. You get to go to heaven anyway, for the right price. Those people were seen as corrupt. You're selling heaven for money. How does that make any sense? And so when a lot of there were popes we know of, there were archbishops who had mistresses, who had children out of wedlock, who even married secretly, who amassed huge amounts of wealth from the church. and from being, an upper person in the church. And so all of these things began to really rankle the population at large, who were being told, they had to marry inside the church with a priest there, or they weren't even married. So there was a lot of that created more and more distrust and dissension, because they saw that the church was telling people, this very rigid way of behaving, but wasn't acting that way. And more as literature is going to come out, they're going to be criticizing church. If there's an evil person or a person who's corrupt in the story, it's almost always going to be a priest, because he's going to be a hypocrite. He's going to, demand this sort of something or certain morality, and then secretly be very corrupt himself morally. And that's going to be the standard as we go through secular literature. There are some exceptions, though. St. Francis of Assisi is probably the most notable one for this period. And there are several churches that are literally filled with murals of him and his acts and the events of his life. Now, he's distinct for one big reason, is that he had what is called stigmata. And it's a very rare condition where usually it's your hands and feet or similar areas, your extremities bleed, and they bleed continuously, like his whole life. He would have open sores on his hands and feet. Those were considered to be signs reminiscent of Christ and Christ on the cross, because he was nailed to it with his hands and feet. And so, and he actually, he studied as a priest, and essentially was very upset by some of the corruption in the traditional church. And so he started the Franciscan order, which was a very strict order of friars, who essentially took a vow of a true poverty and a vow of celibacy. And they said that the strict rule was your job was to serve other people for the rest of your life. So that's the whole purpose of your life from here. And as soon as you take our vows and you are a Franciscan friar, your job is to serve everyone else. It's never going to be about yourself anymore. Absolute self-negation. So he followed that. And so he became the patron saint of animals. He became the patron saint of lost people. He was the patron saint of everybody. Everybody loved him. He was wonderful. And then he died. And the truth is he was the antithesis of what so many people saw the church becoming. He was that bright spot of hope. This is what the church could be if the people in it did what they were supposed to. And yet the other ones didn't. So. And there's quite a discussion in the chapter about the frescoes that are being created at this time. And it's the first time that we really have art that's showing scenes, as opposed to just people posed and staring straight back at the viewers. A lot of these early frescoes, and frescoes are painted on the walls themselves, but they lay wet plaster down. Well, you can do two. You can do dry plaster or wet plaster, but wet plaster is better. They would lay wet plaster down, and before it dried, they'd paint the entire scene. So when it dries, all the paint is permanently fixed into the plaster. So, but these were actual, you can see from this photograph of one of the scenes that nobody's looking at the audience at all. It's not really true, dimensions, because the angles are a little wonky, but they're trying to use three-dimensional perspective. And the people themselves are all looking at each other and interacting with each other, and we are kind of ignored. This is the first time that Western art will look like this. Eastern art already has a lot of these things, China and Japan, but this is the first time in a long, long, long time, really since the Greeks, when perspective is even attempted, because everything for a long time has been very flat and certainly very centered towards the viewer. So Mary looks at us, Jesus looks at us, scenes of it's all about us and that direct interaction with the viewer. So just wanted to, and I talked a little bit about the Virgin Mary, but then we have what is called the cult of the Virgin. It's not really a cult. Okay, I don't know why they call it this. It's irritating. But essentially what it said is there are two types of women. There's the Virgin Mary women, they're the women who are chaste, or if they're not virginal, then they're married, and they're chaste. So they don't ever sleep around with anybody, and they don't ever do anything that's unseemly. They're always very shy and reserved, and they don't put themselves out there. And they're just really beautiful, lovely women who are just, they know their place. And then the other side is the essentially the prostitute, the if you can't be this, you become the fallen woman. You're and your if your chastity is taken, even by force, like if you are raped, then you might as well be dead, because you can no longer be the chaste woman that you once were. And so it places women into two different slots. You're either the virginal, chaste, absolutely pure woman, or you are fallen, and you might as well be a prostitute. And so it's funny because women aren't allowed to be anywhere in between. They're either, and much of the value of a woman throughout later medieval Europe is placed. It's still, even today, there's some emphasis on women being beautiful and chaste. And if you're not beautiful, or even if you're beautiful and you're not chaste, well, that's terrible. You need to be both pure and even when you're married, and even, oh, if you read romance novels today, so many of the women they don't even know the word sex exists. They've never even seen a guy, let alone a guy naked. And the men have been with 82 million women, but it's men are supposed to be experienced. Women are supposed to be absolutely inexperienced and chaste. Virginal first and then chaste. Otherwise, they've corrupted themselves. And beautiful. They must be beautiful. So with that emphasis, of course, the Virgin Mary rises up even more in people's estimation. And whole churches are designed completely around the idea of, championing Mary. So this is in Spain. It's one of the coolest cathedrals I've ever seen, really. And it was not built originally as a mosque. It was built as a catedral. But the Catedral de Santa Maria, or the Cathedral of St. Mary, it is in a Spanish style, and it definitely has, its styling is reminiscent definitely of Islamic mosques in Spain, which have a very unique style. But this was built completely, and from the beginning all the way until, and even till now, it still is in honor of St. Mary. So if you were part of the cult of the Virgin, or you wanted to pray to Madonna, this was the place to go, because she was everywhere. She was in every one of the little transepts on the side, and from the beginning to the very back wall, she's everywhere. It's all about coming in and praying to Mary, Mother of God. And so that was kind of part of that transfer over to Mary. Now, the other thing was happening is that there was a lot of other writing going on. So remember back in the early medieval period, there were all these priests, and they translated stuff, and they wrote down Beowulf, and but mostly they just made copies of the Bible. With the advent of universities, however, people had a lot more access to writing and learning to read their own languages, writing in the vernacular. So if you lived in Germany, maybe you'd study Latin, but you might just study German. And people started writing all popular literature, from the Arthurian tales all the way through into other stuff, in the vernacular. And when they did that, suddenly their literature was not intended for priests. It was intended for the public at large. So this would end up fostering literacy to a great degree. Remember, up until this time, way less than 10% of the population could read. Now, people have access to reading. And even if they can't read, they can listen to tales that are in their own language. And so probably the first that really made a name for himself was Dante Alighieri. He was a poet who lived in Florence, Italy. And he was exiled by the HRCC, by the Holy Roman Catholic Church, because he had some differences with some of the bishops in his area. And the Holy Roman Catholic Church had, again, they were fighting with each city and township, for control. And the people who were in charge in Florence didn't want the church to be in charge. So the church had divisions with one of the biggest families there, the Medici family, who were very, very, very wealthy bankers. And even though they were not nobility, they had more money than the vast majority of the nobility. But they wrangled back and forth with the church about some things. And there were Medici who were exiled as well. But Dante was actually exiled to an island off of Italian coast. And while exiled, he wrote what he said was a trilogy that was meant to, win over the church and let them, make it so they let him return to Florence. It did not. It actually infuriated the church because he actually put a lot of the big church bigwigs into levels of hell. And so he never actually returned to Florence. He was never allowed to. And it was written in Italian. So he did not call it, they call it the Divine Comedy. He just called it the Commedia. But they call it divine because it talks about, the Inferno is all about hell. Purgatory is all about purgatorio is all about purgatory, or that kind of way station where you like earn your way up into heaven if you're not quite good enough to get there. And Paradiso covers all of the different levels of heaven. And it was written for regular people. So probably Inferno is the most well-known and most read of the three, but it's also the most interesting. And part of it is that he determines this is all about what happens to people when they've sinned and they die and then they go to hell. Where do they go and how are they punished and what is hell like? And so he invented these 9 levels, and it's the Trinity times 3. So it's 3 times 3 is that beautiful, perfect number. And so the first circle is just limbo. It's where people who were just, like all of the classical authors are all there. Because they were pre-Christian. They couldn't go to heaven because they didn't know Christianity. And so then the next lowest are the people who lusted after each other and were caught in bed together, or caught, something happened to them and killed them as they were still in the midst of sin. And then the next ones were the gluttons, and it kind of goes down. And I have this chart here and the book describes it some too. But at the very bottom are the treacherous people who kill their masters, and down in the actually affixed in the floor of the bottom of hell is Satan, and his wings are flapping. He's huge and ghastly, and he has 3 heads, and the 3 heads are chewing on 3 other treacherous people, pretty famous. 2 of them are Cassius and Brutus, who were senators who killed Julius Caesar, because Dante's an Italian, so he's a Roman. And then the middle one is Judas Iscariot, who killed, or at least helped betray, Jesus, who was, his friend and master. So that's where all the super bad people go, is the very, very bottom of hell. There's some really interesting things though. Like he designed punishments that really fit the crime. So for instance, in the 7th circle in violence, people who are violent to themselves are the suicides, people who committed suicide during their lives. Obviously, you can't repent that because you've killed yourself. And so they end up being placed in hell, but they are trees and bushes because they killed the body they were given the first time, so they're not given another body. And the only way that they can speak is if somebody accidentally breaks off a branch and it starts to bleed, and then they can speak. And it's painful for them to do so, but they really need to tell their own story and say what happened. So it's both sad and poignant, and Dante actually finds himself sympathetic because he walks through, his little character walks through, almost like a video game, walks through all the different levels of hell. They should make a video game out of this. This would be cool. I would play it. And then Dante really feels bad for a lot of these people. Now, in the 6th level of hell are the heretics, and the 7th level are the frauds. And he puts a lot of church people in those 2 categories. In fact, the Pope is in the 8th circle of hell, and his feet are being burned by a big flame. He's actually in a little tube, and his feet are being burned. And that was what happened to church officials who committed fraud. So of course, he was criticizing the church still. Purgatory, though, is kind of cool because people have to work their way up the mountain of purgatory. And I think yeah. So you can see hell is upside down in this. So they go through hell from the bottom and then get down to that little tube that goes through the earth. And then they end up on a mountain. And to go up the levels of purgatory, you have to, be able to walk, and you can't even move forward unless the sun is out, because the sun, it emphasizes the sun, Jesus. And so God's help is what's getting you up to heaven. Then once you make it up those levels, then you can get to heaven. And heaven is this lustrous place that's actually really boring of the three. I like the Inferno, but Purgatory is probably my favorite because it seems like you can do something about things. But it was, honestly, audiences loved this book. It went through, I mean, tons and tons of people read it, and they read it in Italian because that's what it was written in. And the church didn't like it, but people did. And that sparked more work in vernacular languages as well. Arthurian fiction and poetry was very common, a lot of folk tales. Eventually, we're going to get to we're going to go beyond the kind of courtly literature. These are all about knights. Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, I actually have my students in World Lit read that one. And all of these are about, there's Joan of Arc, although that's based on an actual person. Then Morte d'Arthur is probably the biggest, most expansive work that starts with Arthur's birth, King Arthur's birth, and goes all the way to his death. And so that's definitely one I would recommend. And then we get the Heptameron, and that's actually has a lot of courtly stories in it, as my students also get to read. But these are in all different languages: French and German and English and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, and it's just wherever you're living, that's what you get. German, lots and lots of German, even though most of these listed here are French. And then we have two other big books that have a big effect, and they're both really collections of short stories, of folk tales. They weren't considered short stories yet, but these are folk tales. They're often told almost as jokes, or let me tell you this really cool story of the three men who walked in at a bar, that kind of thing. And so it was all set behind the backdrop of the plague. And so these young people are trying to flee from the city so they don't die of the plague, and they get together, 7 women and 3 men, and they go out to the countryside, and for 10 days, they tell 10 stories every day. So each person gets to tell a story. And one person is the leader each day, and that person says, I want stories that are all sad, or stories about religion, or stories that are funny, or anything like that, or romantic stories. And then all 10 people tell a story. So this collection, though, it totals up, and literally the tales don't even have like titles. It's day 1, story 7, and day 4, story 3. So it's hard to. I wouldn't suggest ever just reading them all the way through, because they'll just run together. But a lot of the stories, they're all written in Italian, just like the Commedia. But they're all about funny characters, and it's upper class and middle class and lower class people. And the clergy, almost to a person, are bad. Clergy try to sleep with women. They are corrupt, and they're stealing from people. They are lecherous and grotesque. They're not devout, and they just pretend, and they're hypocrites. So, it's funny because that becomes the standard view of a lot of church officials. And a lot of it is because of what people are experiencing. They have these officials, these people with tremendous power, who are really corrupting themselves and using that power in bad ways. So that becomes, kind of the view of church, which is, I'm sure, not what the church wanted, but it just kind of happened. So a lot of them are really funny tales. Some of them are really bawdy. I just want to warn you, because when you start reading it, because it's a bit, some of it, and that includes Chaucer too. In England, Chaucer kind of tried to do what Decameron had done, and he didn't finish it. He actually had 24 distinct characters that he created, and he wrote it in Old English. but he really only, I think he only finished, actually finished, like, I think 20 tales. And knowing, and what he did though is his frame wasn't the plague. It was everybody, all these people are going to Canterbury to see the Canterbury Cathedral where Thomas Becket was assassinated and bloodied up really bad. So Thomas Becket became Saint Thomas Becket, Saint Thomas a Becket, and pilgrims went to the church to go and see where had been slaughtered. And that's what these people are doing. They're all on a pilgrimage on a road, and they decide to tell stories to make the time go faster, because otherwise the journey's long. And so they were supposed to each tell 4 tales. So with 24 people, that was almost 100 stories. So we're supposed to get up to 96, but that never happened. Some of the stories are really funny. Some of the stories are extremely bawdy. So, and they have some naughty words in them too. So don't say, well, she told me to go read a Canterbury Tale. If you really want to try one, I'll give you one that's a bit safe. If you really want the bawdy ones, though, I can tell you what they are. One of the stories that comes out of this, though, is one that if you are a Harry Potter fan, you might be somewhat familiar with, because it is the basis, and there's several versions of it out in other literature as well, but it's the basis for the Deathly Hallows. So if you read all the way to the last book of Harry Potter, the Deathly Hallows story that he even talks about in Tales of Beedle the Bard is originally from Canterbury Tales, and it's called The Three Men in Death. It's the Pardoner's Tale. And the 3 men decide people are dying of the plague, and so they decide they're going to go out and they're going to track down Death and kill him. Of course, they're all drunk. Well, they ask a man, so where can we find Death? And he says, oh, it's under a tree over at the end of just outside of town. And they go to the tree and they find, instead of Death, they find this big bag of gold. And they think, woo, all right, so who cares about Death? We'll just get rich. And they send one of the 3 men back into town to get some food and drink. Well, while he's gone, the 2 men sit there and they go, well, why should we share the bag among 3 people? When he comes back, let's just kill him. And then we can just split it half and half. And the other guy's like, yeah, sure. And then the 3rd guy who went to town is in town buying the wine and the food. And he thinks, why'd they send me, first of all? And why do I have to get the food and the wine? And why should I have to share with them? And he poisons the wine that he brings back. So he gets back, he goes, here's the wine and food. And he's thinking, ha, 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 they're going to be dead. And they set upon him and kill him. And then they say, woo, we did it. And they open up the wine and the food and they start eating and they drink the wine and they die because they're poisoned. And so what happens? All 3 men, out of greed, meet death. Now, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but if you are familiar with the Deathly Hallows, those are 3 brothers, and those 3 brothers are told very much in the style of a fairy tale. The first brother asks for this, and this happens. The second brother asks for this, and this happens. And then the 3rd brother asks for this, and this happens. And that's very much the standard. I mean, it's kind of like, think of 3 Little Pigs. And I mean, actually, there are a lot of fairy tales that have those 3 sisters or 3 brothers, and they have some sort of test or some sort of something, and people either fail spectacularly and often die, or they succeed and they live happily ever after. So, but that's just, again, one other something. The other thing is a lot of the people who tell these tales, like for instance the pardoner who told that tale of the 3 men in death, was admittedly a corrupt dude. He sold pardons for money, and he brags about how much money he makes at it and how the pardons are really just pieces of paper. But people will be fooled, and so he's willing to fool them. And everybody else is super critical of him. They're just like, how can you be so corrupt? Then he tells this very moral tale, and people are furious because they know he's a very immoral person who's a hypocrite. And so it's, again, it's very common for these people, the characters who are clerical, who are clergy, to come across as not honest or even outright corrupt in these stories, or lecherous, even worse. And since priests were supposed to be celibate, that kind of thing was super frowned upon. Of course, Protestantism will change that. And then I told you about the Partner's Tale. The Knight's Tale is a good chivalric romance, but honestly, a lot of Arthurian literature is better. The Prioress's Tale is a weird story, and it's very anti-Jewish. But of course, the prioress is a nun, so she's going to be very religious. If you really want the body ones, I did write them in here. The as far as I can tell, the most body, the naughtiest ones are the Miller's Tale and the Reeves Tale. And the Miller's Tale makes fun of a Reeve and his family, and then the Reeves Tale makes fun of a Miller. But they're very naughty. Okay, this is not something that I'm suggesting you read. I really like the Three Men in Death, though, and I usually have people read that. And the Knight's Tale is a little long, but it's still good. The nun, the wife of Bath's Tale, I should have put that in here instead. It's very good, but it's chivalric. It has a knight who actually does something really. He rapes a woman at the beginning, and he has to go find out, on pain of death, what women want most. And so that has its own message of, how much, and really, what does the woman say? The wife of Bath says, what women want is to be in control. We don't want to be helpless. And it's a tale. Honestly, it's something that a lot of women go, yeah, I kind of agree with that. But it kind of has little links to like Beauty and the Beast type of thing, where he has to pick the right choice, or he's going to be in big trouble. And so that's kind of where it goes. Anyway, that's it for now. But all of these things, from the 100 Years' War to the plague to the influx of classical texts and the rise of humanism, all of these things are going to contribute to what we're going to talk about in Unit 3, and that is the Renaissance, both in Italy first and about 150 years later in Northern Europe. So we will talk about that then, though. Thank you for listening. Bye.